morning, everybody. It's a wet and rainy day here in Wales, which is most welcome because we've had such a dry spell, so it's really nice to have a bit of rain falling. So yeah, I had yesterday off because it was my birthday yesterday, so I went out and did fun things, but it's back to work today. We're going to be dyeing this month's Seasonal Changes pack. So the Fibre went into soak when I was in work on Monday, and I tallied up the votes this morning. Just I was sending out some emails to a few people who emailed me yesterday, and they were waiting for replies. So we're going to do the one that was the winner, which came in with a late running surge, which was Harvest Storms. It really looked like Fishing Fleet was going to be the winner. So Harvest Storms is this yellowy goldeny colour, so we've got lots of blues and lots of yellows. Bizarrely, it reminds me of the colours of one of my old school uniforms, which was blue and yellow. But I think it's going to be a nice change from a lot of the colours that we've had recently. It is quite summery, but it's not too pretty, if that makes sense. So I think it's going to give us some nice contrasts going on. So hopefully we can get some good colours going on with that. Right. Normally, quite often I start off with the lightest colour, but I think in this case I'm going to start off with the darkest colour, which is like a very dark blue Air Forcey type grey, but it's very, very dark. So this is going to be our darkest colour. So as those of you who have now been along to lots of these live streams will know, but for anybody that's not watched me create these colour palettes before, there's 5 colours in a Seasonal Changes pack. And generally, I always try to make sure there is one colour that is very, very dark and at least one colour that is very, very light. And then the rest of the colours somewhere in between, because as well as colour contrast, when we're creating things with stripes or with colour work, we also need to have tonal variation. So it's important that we create colours that will visually, if we looked at them on grayscale, would appear almost black, and colours that when we looked at them in grayscale would appear almost white. And then we have some variety in the middle. When you get a lack of contrast, when everything would look like almost the same shade of grey if you were to view it in black and white. So anyway, that's what we're going to start off with doing first. We're going to dye this really dark blued grey. Now, the funny thing is, when I look at this blued grey, I think it's also got a tiny little hint of green in it. She's just poking her nose right onto the end of her phone. So that's kind of what we're going to go for. So I'm going to start off with one of my dark blue dyes. Yeah, feel the blue. Right. To give us our blue base. We're going to go for, I have a grey dye, which actually is very nearly blue. Let's write that down so far because I think probably I can only remember 2 things at once. Right, 25, 50, great. So I always write down what I'm using kind of as I go along, on the basis being even if I scrap it or add more, I can then change it. But the chances of me remembering the whole thing in one go, pretty slim. And then what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to add in a khaki green dye. And we'll see where we've got to from there. So that was 25 black, 25 khaki. Let's find you. And let's see where we got. So to test these colours out as a real basic testing stage, what I tend to do is I just put them, you can use filter paper, but the kitchen roll works really nicely, and it starts to give you a sense of how dark the colour is, what colour tones there are. Now bear in mind on via my slightly elderly laptop's webcam, it's never very good at picking up the colour, but I think that might be about where we're wanting to get to. Yeah, I think that's not bad. Again, let's go for that. So we're dyeing that colour there, that middle one there. So that's roughly where we've got to. So that's a nice dark blued grey. Let me put that to one side as being I've dyed that. That's not one to be using for anything else. We've then got another grey tone, but this is a grey with a tiny hint of brown in it. It's not like a silvery grey. It's the one on the far left-hand end of the palette if anybody's got the images up on the screen. But we don't want anywhere near as much dye in this one. So let's go for, because I want it to definitely appear grey rather than any other colour, because yellows tend to be quite pale, but just by they tend to be visually quite pale, so I don't want to make those too dark. So let's start off with 25 of grey, and I don't think I want as much brown as what one dispense in pump will give me. So I'm going to start off with less brown and then probably just keep adding bits of the colour in. So yeah, she said, oh, those bar optics, they are indeed bar optics. They work really well for recipes where, well, when I'm just generally dyeing and I know, and I'm not dyeing to a specific recipe and I only want I can either definitely measure at 25 millilitres, or I can go for that's roughly half of it, so I've got roughly to 10, 12 out of it. They don't work quite so well for these repeatable measurements, so I do tend to have to then pull them off and put them into smaller containers and then use syringes to measure out smaller amounts, but that tends to be less of how I dye anyway. Doing these seasonal changes packs is one of the few times when I spend a lot of time doing really small quantity dyeing, because generally I'm sort of dyeing 600 grams in one go. So we have added in, to start off with, I've just put 5 brown in there. We'll see what that looks like on the basis that I can then add in more if needed, and I've just put some water in there to dilute it down a little bit. So that's where where are we? This one. And again, these are all just looking really, really dark on my computer screen. I don't know how they're coming out over on yours. This one is definitely a paler colour. Has it got enough brown in it? I think I want a little bit more brown. I think it's not quite, it's still too grey. So we're going to put another 5 of brown in there. There we go. So that's just shifted the colour. So that was the original one, and then that's with the slightly increased bit of brown in there. So it's just shifted it more into being a greyed brown rather than any other colour. Right, let's do our final grey colour. So this one, it's still not a particularly blue toned grey, which can sometimes be a little bit of an issue because the grey dye that I use is blue and the black dye that I use is actually purple. So coming up with greys that are slightly greeny toned can actually be really quite tricky. And this one is definitely more silvery. We definitely don't need as much dye. So what I'm going to do, it's not doing out of containers, I'm going to use the syringe to measure off less grey because I want this to be much paler than the other tone of grey that we had. It's a random bit of fluff. Okay, let's go for 5 of that grey. So I need to counteract the blue slightly and shift it into being ever so slightly green. Now, our basic colour theory tells me if this is slightly blue, in order to make it green, I need to add a little bit of yellow into it. But probably not an awful lot, because if we put too much in there, we're going to actually end up with green. So this is where these measuring syringes come in handy, and we need to measure out 1 milliliter. There we go. Right, so let's try 1 milliliter of a yellow dye. We're going to add some water because, as ever, we need to make this paler to represent what it's going to look like onto the fibre. Okay, so that's our pale grey. So you can see how we've got variation in our grey tones. We've got a very, very dark one. This is looking a little bit darker on camera than it is in real life, and it's also not going to be quite that dark once it's dried, because these are all still wet. And then that's going to be our palest grey. So we've got a nice tonal variation amongst the greys. The original, that original silver grey is possibly got a tiny bit of brown in it, but I'm going to leave it as a sort of slight tweak interpretation of what the colour palette was that we chose from, just because I think it's going to help give us more variation in colour. So sometimes I kind of look at the colour palette and go, yes, but for what we're using it for as fibre, I want to do something ever so slightly different. So that just leaves us with our two yellows. So we've got two yellows. We've got one that's almost heading over the border into orange, and we've got one that is kind of like a pale corn type colour. So we're going to start off with the pale corn type colour. Let's have a closer look at that one. It's definitely got some hints of other colours into it. So I'm probably going to use... Let's use the rest of this lemony yellow. Okay. It's given me 20 of that. And I'm then just going to put the tiniest hint of the brown into it. Let's see where that takes us to. Let's go for 2 of that brown. This might be that it's not warm toned enough. Okay, so you can see that by putting that brown in it there, we've ended up with something that's kind of a bit mustard toned rather than the sort of warmer goldeny yellow colours that we've got in the original palette. And I think one of the reasons that palette sort of appealed to so many people is that although we've got the cool greys, we've got the real pops of warm colours as well. So what I am going to do is I want to warm these colours up a bit. We shall reach for some red. And we're not going to want very much of this in here, because if we put too much in it, that's a really worn out orange. Let's go for you, see if you're any better. That's going to just, if we put it too much, we're going to definitely end up at orange. And I don't want orange, I still want it to be yellow. So let's just go for 1 of that red. And that's made a massive difference to the way the colour appears. Okay, that's better. So you can see just by adding in that tiny little bit of red dye how we've shifted the colour tone from being very, very mustardy to something that's got a little bit more of a hint of orange. So that's okay. That's going to work. Right, we want one more, because we're now going to dye our darkest, with the colour for our darkest yellow. So we had 1 brown, 1 red. So yeah, we now need our darkest yellow colour, which is almost a golden shade. So let's go for 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's giving me 100 of our daffodil yellow. Okay, now by itself this is a lovely golden yellow, but it could just do with, in order to work for this colour palette, it needs shifting slightly more over into the orange shade of things. So again, we're going to reach for our red and our brown. So let's go for 5 red. And I'm just going to dirty it down a little bit with this brown. Is there anything left in here that I can get out? Or do I need to put some more off? Drip. Okay. So I've just put some red and some brown in it. So it's sort of similar to the same recipe that we've used for our paler colour, but just more intense and based off a slightly different yellow. Another blob of that. There we go. Okay, so that's there's 2 dots of it, but that's the colour that we have ended up with for our really dark yellow. So if we pull up our screen, it's that one, and it's this one that's right on the end. So you can see how even though we've used the same basic elements to create this one, they're tonally different for enough from one another that they're going to be contrasting. So we've got this one, which is our palest yellow, which was made using a cooler toned yellow with a little bit of red and a little bit of brown. And this one, which is our warmer toned yellow, but with the addition of more red and more brown, but much more dye. So it's going to appear to be much, much darker. So that is going to be, we've got the dark blue grey there, the brown grey, a paler sort of silvery colour, our reddy browny yellow, and then our darker yellow on here. So that's going to be our colour palette for Harvest Storms. And what I'm going to do next is get that dye onto the fibre, which I'll carry on doing that and talking my way through it. But at the same time, if you've seen me do lots of these, you've probably seen me pour dye onto fibre quite a few times by now, so I won't be at all offended if you go, I've got things to do and I need to disappear off. But equally, if you want to stick around, then you are very welcome to do so. So yeah, the fibre went into soak on Monday afternoon, just to make sure it gets nice and wet. Sometimes I can get away with doing it the morning before, but I like to do it the day before. I like to do it at least the day before, because that way. Let's have you over here, so I'm not walking backwards and forwards. Yeah, that way I can kind of come in and get straight to work without having to spend 45 minutes, sort of half an hour, just weighing out fibre. So these are all dyed on Cambrian wool, which is a Welsh Mountain crossed with the Blue-Faced Leicester, and these are all the shearling fleeces. They get specially selected out at the Wool Marketing Board and sent off for processing up in Yorkshire. And it's a lovely long stapled fibre, very even, a nice open crimp, but with still a nice bit of life about it. It's got a little bit of a sheen. It's very even to spin. It's kind of a good compromise between durability and softness. A lot of people can get away with wearing it next to skin, but at the same time, if you make a jumper out of it, it's not going to pill and turn into a messy looking garment really, really quickly. Okay, so we're just making sure that the dye gets nice and evenly spread throughout the fibre. And I always describe these as being semi-solid colourways. If you want an even flat colour, then it's commercially dyed. So they are mostly all the same colour, but with a little bit of variation and movement in them. And I do a lot of dyeing this fibre into these little mixed colour packs. So in part because it means you can get, if you've been collecting them over the past few years of me doing this, along with the colours that are in the shop on a regular basis, you can really develop quite a large sort of colour palette of things to play about with, either for using as colour work yarns or for using blending boards and drum carders and things. And because they're just in 20-gram quantities, you can get quite a lot of colours quite quickly and quite easily. Right, next bit. So we've just done the darkest yellow. But yeah, and the clear liquid that was going on, if anybody isn't aware, is citric acid, which is basically just concentrated lemon juice. It's the stuff that's used in bath bombs as well, because the dyes that we use on wool are what's called acid dyes, and all that means is that we just need slightly acidic conditions in order to get the dye to bond onto the wool. One of the things that popped up on Instagram a few weeks ago now was a dye company called Fibre Optic Yarns did sort of a scientific testing out of sort of what happens when you wash your wool. So I wrote an article for Ply magazine quite a while ago about thinking about what happens when we dye wool with different water conditions, because our water here is spring water, and it's spring water that comes. We're on clay, and our soil is also very acidic. And also has a lot of iron deposits in it. But in different parts of the country, the water will be nowhere near as acidic. If you're particularly down in London and the southeast, your water tends to be neutral, heading towards even being basic, slightly alkali, and will have more by way of sort of lime deposits in it. And that's why you get limescale buildup in your kettles and showers and things like that. And they did a test on when you wash wool with water of different acidities. So when I finished dyeing Fibre here, once it's dyed to what's known as exhaustion, which is where once you test the liquid surrounding the Fibre, and all the water that's surrounding it is completely clear. There's no dye particles that are not bonded onto the Fibre. Everything, all the dyes have made an attachment to the wool. And then once it's cooled, I rinse it here in water that is sort of hotter than I can put my bare hands into, if I have to wear gloves in order to put my hands into it. And I just use an unscented bio-friendly washing up liquid, because I go through a lot of detergent. It's cheap, it's really nice and effective, and works really well. It rinses out nicely, but still sort of pulls out any dirt and any loose dye that might have appeared. And pretty much I get no colour runoff from once I've dyed to exhaustion, and I do that final rinse in water with detergent, and then rinse in water of the same temperature to wash the final bit of detergent out. But one of the things that this sort of came about as a result of doing this testing is what happens if your water is not acidic. If you've got very limey water, the dye bonds to the Fibre is not always extremely permanent. The dye can disassociate from the Fibre, and it's more likely to dissociate from the Fibre if the water is alkali or heading to or neutral or alkali rather than acidic. So even though I can rinse the Fibre here and get no dye runoff, because my water is naturally acidic, I'm never going to get any dye runoff. But if you're in like the southeast or places, and people's skin chemistry also has an effect on this. If when you're spinning you find you're always getting blue dye on your fingers, the chances are your skin is ever so slightly more basic, more alkali than most people's. Or it might be that you use a hand cream that causes some of the dye to dissociate. So it always used to be that sort of saying, oh, put vinegar in your rinse water, it'll help the dye set. It doesn't help the dye to set, but it does help mean that the dye is less likely to break from its bonds with the Fibre. So if you always have problems with dye bleeding in your rinse water, the thing about putting some vinegar in there actually is helpful. It won't mean that if you've got unbonded dye in the first place, it won't help with that, but it will mean that you are less likely to get just some of that slightly tinted colour water from the fact that these are acid dyes and they require slightly acidic conditions in order to work best. So that's something to bear in mind if you always have trouble with dye bleeding. But anyway, going back to my ply article that I wrote, because one of the things that I used to go and do pre-COVID, and actually I'm off to go and teach a dye workshop for the first time post-COVID next weekend, is the fact that when I used to travel to different parts of the country, it's noticeable how much longer sometimes it takes for dye to bond. And yeah, Andrew's asked which issue of Ply was the article in again. The one that I wrote, I can't remember, to be quite honest with you. Might have been Science, but I don't think it was, because that's a really recent one. I can't recall. Ask me again in the Fellowship of Yarn, and I will pull it out for you and look it up. If you haven't found it by then. But yeah, and it is noticeable how when I go and dye in different parts of the country, the dyes do respond differently, particularly when you're making mixtures of dyes like this. There's some colour combinations you put together, and they sort of create what's almost like called a chroma effect. If they bleed, they sort of, the different dyes have different bonding temperatures. And like, I think I dyed some silk yarn and I dyed some ram buoy, and you could noticeably see how the fact that the turquoise dye has to bond at a higher temperature, and you also almost got like the lime scale in the water, because I got friends and family to ship me bottles of water through the country from different parts of the country. Yeah, so I had some coming down from the south. I had some coming from friends that were up in Yorkshire. So that I got a real wide range of different water types from different places. And the places where you tend to get limescale in your kettles and things, they ended up with almost like the limescale deposit in the water. You could see it, but like stained blue. It was most bizarre, most interesting, and definitely sort of reveals why sometimes in dye workshops I was just like, why is this dye not exhausting? Because it's had plenty long enough at a plenty higher temperature. It's been made to be really acidic, because I always tend to go for sort of belt and braces approach with making sure that there's enough citric acid in places where I don't know the water. And the chances are, actually, I think it was probably that the lime deposits, the calcium deposits in the water, they'd got stained by the dye more than the dye wasn't exhausted. But yeah, so dye chemistry is a interesting thing, and there's lots of people who, when they're doing it on an industrial scale, they are very, very technical about it, because time is money and materials are money. So there's lots of processes devoted to making it as efficient and as environmentally friendly as possible, because the less water you can use, the less heat you can use, the more money that you save. And wasting dyes are expensive. It's one of the reasons why I do bits and pieces of Procyon dyeing, but it always drives me slightly mad, because if anybody's ever done any Procyon dyeing, you never properly get the dye to exhaust. So when you Procyon dyeing is a cold water process on cellulose fibre, and that does require alkali conditions, but you basically leave it, the amount of dye you use is in relation to the quantity of fibre, but in order to you basically pull your fibre out when it's reached the colour you want, because some of the dye naturally bonds onto the water molecules. And then you have to rinse and rinse and rinse and rinse and rinse. It's a real pain. I sort of hate doing it, because there's so much rinsing that you have to do. And particularly here, because we're not on mains water, it's one of those things that doing it in the summer can be a little bit of a pain, sort of just looking at these gallons, litres and litres and litres of water. And in the first few stages, it's still quite brightly coloured, so you can't even really use it for watering the garden with. Once you've done a few rinses and it starts to get a bit paler, I don't mind using it for watering quite so much, but it's still just so It takes a lot of energy. So yeah, so anybody out there who dyes a lot of protein fibres, I'm sort of quite in awe of them, because in comparison to my nice acid dyes, which are pretty water efficient really. Yeah, right, there we go. That is our finished colour palette. So we've got the dark ones look darker than they're going to be. This one has maybe turned out a little bit greener than than off the original photo, but actually I really like it anyway. So which is the joy of this sometimes. You can never entirely tell what colours these are going to be until after they've been heat set, rinsed and have been dried again. But that's roughly the palette that we're going to get. They're going to be in the shop the end of, well, 1st of July is the Saturday, so it'll probably be the following Monday. I didn't do a live stream last month because the end of May was really busy because I was often out teaching. So I did a dyer's choice as a sort of quick and speedy way of doing it, because I didn't have time to put a vote up at the end of May, and didn't have time to set up a filming session either. So that's still available. That one is Delphinium, which has got lots of really intense royal blues and purples and things in it. We will be back next month with another colour choice. Tour de Fleece starts on Saturday. So if you are interested in coming and spinning along with us, you're very welcome, no matter what you are spinning. I have finally finished writing all of the daily summary posts. I think they're going to be, you're going to enjoy reading those. So sort of bits about lots of lovely bits of pictures of France and French history, French recipes, and bits and pieces about the special Hilltop Cloud Fibre that we are opening up each and every single day. So yeah, so I'm going to crack on and get some more fibre dyed. I'm doing some Jamesons and Smith's Shetland for the rest of the day. So that'll be ready for going up online in the next few days as well. Yeah, and I think I've also got some Superwash BFL and Marmee picked out that's ready to dye. So yeah, so lots of dyeing coming up. I'm at home for pretty much all of July, and then I've got some time off booked in August, so that'll be good. Okay, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and I shall see you all again soon.